Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Americans for Limited Government news update. Today's news hits close to home for me because I am one of the millions of Americans who is alive today thanks to biopharmaceutical drugs. Simply put, as a type 1 diabetic, I've depended on daily insulin shots since I was a teen. But President Joe Biden has just announced he wants to take control of my relationship with my doctor by picking winners and losers on my medicines. It all started with the so-called Inflation Reduction Act Biden signed into law last year. What most people don't know is that it contains a provision which gives federal bureaucrats the authority to, quote, negotiate the price of prescription drugs covered under Medicare. But let's get real, folks. It's not a negotiation when the federal government gives you a directive. Try negotiating with the Internal Revenue Service on paying less taxes. The president of Americans for Limited Government, Rick Manning, breaks it down for us.
Basically, the federal government is saying, we want to dictate this market and we're only going to pay this much, which sounds like a good idea. Problem is, the net effect is it's going to end up having intense problems in terms of those drugs being available to the overall and any new drugs being developed. If Joe Biden is going to be determining what the price of the drug is and whether or not your doctor should be giving you a certain drug or another drug based upon the cost, based on what the lowest price of the drug is. If you trust Joe Biden to make that decision, if you trust Joe Biden's healthcare bureaucrats to make that decision, you probably thought Dr. Anthony Fauci did a damn good job.
But that's not all. Manning explains that by going after these life-saving drugs, which include not only drugs for diabetes, but for heart failure, rheumatoid arthritis, blood cancers, and Crohn's disease, the Biden administration is attempting to pay for their Green New Deal energy schemes.
Inflation Reduction Act wasn't about inflation, it's about getting the Green New Deal done. Let's just be clear. That's what they did. To offset the cost of the Green New Deal, they had to find other things that they could say, oh, we're lowering costs on something else. So what they did is they said, oh, we're going to lower the costs to the Medicare on prescription drugs. And by doing this, by price fixing. The irony is, this money isn't going to be credited to the Medicare Trust Fund. This money is effectively being credited to the overall budget as a whole.
And in the long run, Manning explains the medical breakthroughs that have saved the lives of millions of people, not only in America, but around the world, will cease. Under government price controls, America's biopharmaceutical innovators will lose their incentives to invest in the next generation of life-saving drugs.
Small companies that are the real innovators in medicines are already announcing, based upon this legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act, that they are no longer going to be developing new medicines, particularly not new medicines for seniors. So the impact here is simple. If people aren't willing to develop the next Alzheimer's medicine that makes it so you live a more vibrant life with Alzheimer's than currently, if they're not developing a cure for Alzheimer's, if they're not researching the threads that go into figuring out what the 3 different kinds of Alzheimer's that really exist and how each could be treated individually, if they're not investing in that kind of information finding, you're not going to have an Alzheimer's cure. You're not going to have that come through our pipeline because we will have effectively made it stupid, financially stupid to do it.
Oh yeah, and one more thing. Even if you're not on Medicare, but you take prescription drugs, under Biden's prescription drug price fixing scheme, the prices you pay for your medicines could also be higher.
If you have a drug that is where the Medicare patients aren't paying the real cost of the drug, then there's a bubble created. And that means from people who are not in Medicare are going to pay more for that same drug. It's just the way it works because pharmaceutical companies aren't developing drugs to then lose money on them. It costs them $1 billion plus to bring a drug to market. That means they have to get a lot of prescriptions sold at a relatively high price before it goes off a patent. And they do that. That's how it works. We all complain about it because of high-cost drugs, but that's the way it works. It's the way new drugs get brought to market. There's no change in this system to make it so you can bring new drugs to market for less money than $1 billion. even though a vast majority of the money is spent on basically bureaucratic garbage.
If you agree with Americans for Limited Government that we need to stop Biden's government takeover of our prescription drugs, go to our Take Action link in the comments below. Send a message to Washington to stop the takeover of our prescription drugs.